It has long been taught that the most important thing we can know is to know ourselves. One of the best ways to get to know ourselves is to understand how our brain influences our behavior. How we behave is a function of what we think, and what we think is closely tied to what we see, which depends on our viewpoint. Do you know that each hemisphere of the brain gives us a different viewpoint? One hemisphere gives us a local viewpoint, the other gives us a global viewpoint. This arrangement is common throughout nature. Birds, for example, use their local hemisphere to search for seeds on the ground and their global hemisphere to monitor their surroundings. Ultimately, we can inherit any one of 16 viewpoints. But to understand how the brain generates 16, we must understand how it generates 4. To understand the 4, we must be familiar with the 2 that inform the hemispheres. My previous video, The Brain's 4 Operating Systems, explains this. But in case you missed it or would like a review, I'll explain this simple structure again. To understand the brain's effect on our thinking and behavior, we need to understand the autonomous systems that operate the hemispheres. They are the source of our viewpoints. I refer to them as operating systems. They are process management systems. In attempting to heal our social fabric and find peace, we tend to focus on the consequences of our divisions, the battles that we get into. A more effective approach might be to focus on the sources of our divisions and seek a solution there, where our conflicts originate. We are externally divided and polarized because most of us are internally divided and polarized. You might think that the hemispheres always function as equal partners, but for most of us this is not the case. Instead, something called genetic dominance causes one side of the brain to dominate and the other side to be recessive. This leaves us largely unconscious of the contribution of our recessive viewpoint. As I explained in my book, How Whole Brain Thinking Can Save the Future, this arrangement creates people whose primary source of information is their locally oriented viewpoint, and people whose primary source of information is their globally oriented viewpoint, often referred to as left brain dominance and right brain dominance. Because the two sides of the brain have different operating systems and viewpoints, they are predisposed to see and respond to events in different ways. But the systems that operate the hemispheres complement one another. This means that they are two parts of a greater whole. So we just need to learn how to harmonize them. The main obstacle to harmonization is fear. Our local hemisphere is specialized to protect us. It encourages us to be fearful, selfish, and skeptical. From its viewpoint, we are concerned with independence and control. So, out of an abundance of caution, we are inherently reluctant to cooperate. The consciousness this mindset creates has long been a dominant force in society. To get through to the fearful local side of the brain and help it feel safe, we can appeal to its need to know that its values are not threatened. Perhaps the most direct way to accomplish this is to show it that, ultimately, sound, conservative, and liberal ideas are not competitors. They serve one another. Our globally oriented hemisphere gives us an inclusive viewpoint. It shows us how things connect and helps us make connections, as for example, when we recognize similarities. From a global viewpoint, we perceive our knowledge all at once. In other words, we view the context. A global viewpoint, because it reveals literally everything, shows us a world of abundance, which leads us to spend liberally. Our locally oriented hemisphere, which sees and acts in complementary ways, is exclusive. It's focused on separations and helps us recognize differences. We see our knowledge in fragments, sequentially. We see the text. From a local viewpoint, we perceive scarcity and spend conservatively. The roots of our thinking and behavior grow out of genetic dominance. Genetic dominance determines how the two hemispheres relate to one another. Genetic dominance gives us our viewpoints and more. There are three types of genetic dominance: complete dominance, incomplete dominance, and codominance. Complete dominance is the most common of the three types. This is the type we have been discussing. When dominance is complete, either our local hemisphere or our global hemisphere will inform mind and shape our thinking. With just one viewpoint dominant in feeding mind, we are easily polarized. Until educated otherwise, we either see the big picture but have a distorted view of it because we are lacking or misunderstand crucial details, or we see the details but sometimes fail to see the big picture clearly. The other two types of genetic dominance, incomplete dominance and codominance, integrate the operation of the systems that give us our viewpoints. Incomplete dominance combines the two systems and creates a single hybrid system with a hybrid viewpoint. Codominance causes the two operating systems to work as a team. Codominance gives us both a dominant local viewpoint and a dominant global viewpoint. Now that we have reviewed the four basic systems that operate the brain, let's consider how dominance is able to generate 16 operating systems and 16 viewpoints. To arrive at 16, we need only take into account the flow of information. Information flows into the brain, where it is processed and sent to mind. It then flows back out as we react, as we call on the brain to help us craft a response. The inflow of information is processed by one of four operating systems. The outflow of information is processed by one of four. The result is 16 possible combinations that produce 16 different systems of perception, creating 16 variations in the human experience of consciousness. Want to know which system operates your brain? If you're a left-handed woman, chances are your global system processes both information input and output. If you're a right-handed woman, chances are that your global system processes information input, but your local system processes information output, the opposite of left-handed men. Right-handed men usually process both information input and output through their local system. The process of living with and learning from others naturally integrates the operation of the two hemispheres. This tends to blur the lines that might otherwise clearly identify individual genetic influences. And given that the effects of dominance can be subtle, it may be challenging to determine which system operates your brain. Tests for dominance that fail to differentiate information input from information output are unlikely to explain the dominance of individuals such as most right-handed women. With their global hemisphere dominant for input, these women are genetically predisposed to view the world holistically, yet, because their local hemisphere is dominant for output, they default to respond dualistically, as is typical of most men. In closing, let me reiterate that the 16 brain operating systems discussed here are default systems. They shape our thinking only to the degree that we let them. For example, The fear-based energy of a security-oriented local hemisphere will usually suggest a cautious approach to the events of life. Fear is a protective mechanism. But just because our default is to be cautious does not mean we must be. We are always free to act with the abandon of love or to choose a position in between the extremes of fear and love. Regardless of our genetic inheritance, when gathering information and choosing a response to it, we are free to consult our local system, our global system, or to combine them. To achieve our maximum potential, it's vital to be familiar with the systems that manage our information and guide our behavior. We have more choices when we know what our choices are. For more about the brain's two operating systems, watch my video, How to Achieve Whole Brain Thinking. To learn how the brain's operation affects our sexual orientation, watch Gender's 4 Variations, Gender's 16 Variations, and 32 Sexual Orientations, ideally in that order.